Happy Sunday, everybody. Today we're talking about an important commandment that Jesus gave to missionaries when he first called them in the early church, as well as in this modern dispensation. To start, we're going to turn to Luke 9. Here is where Jesus has called the apostles. He's now sending them out as missionaries. And in verses 3 and 4, he says, Jesus said unto them, Take nothing for your journey, neither staves nor scrip, neither bread, neither money, neither have two coats apiece. And whatsoever house ye enter into, there abide, and thence depart. So this is the kind of context in which he's calling missionaries. He's saying, don't take anything with you. He repeats this in the next chapter, Luke 10, when he sends the 70 out as missionaries. In verses 4 and then 7, it says to them, Carry neither purse, nor scrip, nor shoes, and salute no man by the way, and in the same house remain, eating and drinking such things as they give, for the labor is worthy of his hire. Now, what is purse? What is scrip? You've probably heard this phrase before, neither purse nor scrip. Purse just means a bag of money, basically a wallet, right? Provisions for being able to buy things. And then scrip is really just a bag for carrying things. So this is luggage. Take neither wallet nor luggage. Effectively saying, don't bring stuff with you to be prepared. You should just go and rely entirely upon the Lord. The Book of Mormon has at least one potential reference to this type of missionary work with Alma. So Alma gives up the office of chief judge. He decides to travel throughout all the land, building up the church, and apparently follows a similar pattern. Given his stature and prominence, he could have surely arranged for comfortable travel and provisions, but he gets to Ammonihah, and he approaches Amulek, a stranger, and says in Alma chapter 8, verse 19, Will ye give to a humble servant of God something to eat? So clearly he doesn't have his own provisions. He doesn't have his own money to buy stuff. He's relying upon the good graces of others. 2 chapters later, we read that, of course, Amulek has welcomed Alma into his home, but was greatly blessed by Alma's presence. So missionaries were to pack lightly, not taking everything that they need. They were supposed to trust God and other people through God to provide them as they served. Now, you might say that's a relic of a bygone era. That doesn't really apply as much anymore. And yet you would be wrong, because in modern revelation, the commandment was repeated. So less than 4 months after the church is established in 1830, we get section 24 of the Doctrine and Covenants. This is given to Oliver Cowdery, and then, implied for others in his stead as well, following his path as being a missionary. Verse 18, it says, And thou shalt take no purse nor scrip, neither staves, neither two coats, for the church shall give unto thee in the very hour what thou needest for food and for raiment and for shoes and for all money and for scrip. And so that's interesting. It says the church will give it to you. I understand that to mean church in the kind of broad general sense of the community of the saints, the faithful, not necessarily even existing members of the church perhaps, but people that you're out trying to convert and rely upon, because that was always the model, was you'd go out and preach, and then from the very people that you're preaching to, you're soliciting support in terms of, money or food or lodging. So that's D&C 24. Then we get to section 84. This is given in 1832 as a bunch of missionaries are returning from their labors. And here we have several verses of relevance that we're going to go through. First, verses 78 and 79. For I suffered them, meaning the early saints and missionaries, I suffered them not to have purse or scrip, neither two coats. Behold, I send you out to prove the world, and the laborer is worthy of his hire. So there's kind of purpose with not going without, with going without purse or scrip, with not traveling with provisions. The purpose is, among other things, to prove the world, and that the labor is worthy of his hire. So we get some reason behind this. And then we get to a few verses later, 86 and then 89. This is where things get kind of interesting. Verse 86, Therefore, let no man among you, for this commandment is unto all the faithful who are called of God in the church unto the ministry. From this hour take purse or scrip, that goeth forth to proclaim the gospel of the kingdom. Whoso receiveth you, receiveth me, and the same will feed you and clothe you and give you money. Verse 86 is a little grammatically weird. In the original version, when the revelation was given in early decades, they had parentheses, which I think might have read better if we kept that, parentheses around kind of the interrupting phrase of the. So if we remove the interrupting phrase for just a second, it would read, "Therefore let no man among you from this hour take purse or scrip that goeth forth to proclaim the gospel of the kingdom." That interrupting phrase was that this commandment is unto all the faithful who are called of God in the church unto the ministry. So the commandment is that none of the missionaries, are to take money or food or provisions with them when they go do missionary work out in the world. It's a commandment unto all the faithful who are called to be missionaries from this hour, from the time this revelation is given in 1832, again re-emphasizing what was said to Oliver Cowdery 2 years prior, and making clear that no man should be a missionary unless he refuses to take purse or scrip. Let no man among you from this hour take purse or scrip. Okay, so there's some commentary from early church leaders that, of course, support these revelations and add a little bit more color to them. Orson Pratt, for example, 1852, said, "This generation have been calling a long time for miracles, but one of the greatest miracles in the last days, in my estimation, is the fact that scores and hundreds of the missionaries of the Latter-day Saints are traversing the globe, going from nation to nation upon the principle that the ancient apostles traveled, namely, without purse or scrip. Is not that a miracle? Has there any such thing happened before for many generations as people traveling over the whole earth, starting from their homes without purse or scrip?" It was basically saying, this is miraculous that, we are doing this like the early missionaries and apostles and 70 did. It's miraculous, he's saying. Brigham Young, just a few years later, says, "We want the elders of Israel to preach the gospel without purse or scrip and to trust in God for their food, raiment, and lodging." He, of course, having directly experienced this himself as a missionary abroad in England. A decade later, Brigham Young again, this is 1870, a little bit of a lengthier one, but we get some interesting little nuggets here. He says, "I think if our elders were to go without purse or scrip and had nothing to fall back upon, and could not write here," meaning the church in Salt Lake, "for means, but were obliged to take their valise in their hands and preach the gospel as we used to do, they would be much more successful than they are, and would find many more who would be willing to listen to their testimonies. I used to travel without purse or scrip, and many times I have walked till my feet were sore, and the blood would run in my shoes and out of them, and fill my appointments, go into houses, ask for something to eat, sing and talk to them, and when they would commence questioning, answer them. It is near 25 years since we left the confines of the United States. Go back there to Europe, and you will find hundreds and perhaps thousands who are ready to receive the gospel. Only carry it to them as they are prepared to receive it. But while we go and ride in our silver carriages, many never inquire into our principles. They're looking for something else. The meek and lowly Jesus sent his disciples without purse or scrip, and when the honest in heart see our elders go in the same manner that Jesus' disciples did, with the doctrine that he delivered to his disciples, and preach without purse or scrip, our elders will find plenty of honest-hearted persons who will receive their testimony. But when the elders go into the great cities, hire large halls and hire carriages to ride to their pulpit in, the people say it is a speculation, a financial, whatever, a speculation. And such elders do not have much of the Spirit of the Lord to preach to the people. Concluding, our elders who are in the States will do us good. There's no question about it. But they will do themselves and the people good if they will go without purse or scrip. If they travel without purse or scrip when they land in the midst of a community or wherever they want to preach and go into the people's houses and talk with them, pray with them, and sing with them, teaching them the way of life and salvation, they will find there are plenty who are willing to receive them. Okay, so this quote from Brigham Young in 1870 suggests perhaps that it was optional. Not everyone's required to do so. Brigham is calling them to do it, inspiring them, encouraging them, persuading them, but it's not like this mandatory thing that every missionary is doing. It's something to which they should aspire and which they should do, but not necessarily required. One decade later, 1880, we get George Cannon, who says that the elders of this church differ from all others. They go out without purse and scrip, relying upon the Lord, putting their trust in him, devoting their time, their energies, and the ability that God has given unto them for the purpose of enlightening their fellow men concerning that which they know to be the truth. I do not know any greater evidence than this, that men could give to their fellow men of their sincerity. And when men go forth in this way, they're very likely to live, so that the spirit of the Almighty, mighty God of Jacob will be with them. They are likely to feel after it, to seek in faith to obtain God's blessing. When a man is hungry, when he's without money, when he has no friends, he's very apt to feel after some being that has power. If he has any faith in God, he is very apt to exercise it. And by the constant exercise of that faith, if he did not know before he went on his mission that God lives, that God is near, that he hears and answers prayer, he would be very likely to learn these things before a great while, and so become strengthened in his faith, so that he would ask, believing when he did ask, that he would receive the very thing that he desired. God in his mercy has commanded his people to take this course. All right, so plenty more quotes like it. Clearly, it was a thing. It was a widespread thing, maybe not a mandatory thing, but the leaders of the church at the time are saying, this is what we do. This is what sets us apart. It's miraculous. We're doing what Jesus commanded us to. We go, our missionaries go without purse or scrip. Now, what's it like today for missionaries? Well, they take lots of purse and scrip. So, for example, if you go to the church's website, they have this whole page of missionary finance guidelines, lots and lots and lots of guidelines, lots of information about financing missions, about funding them, who funds them, who contributes, how, and all of that. Currently, it's $500 a month per missionary to serve a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That is the requested and expected contribution, whether it comes from the missionary themselves or from the parents or from members of the ward. Now, this was equalized back in 1991. At the time, previous to that, mission costs varied wildly depending on where you were called. And so if someone was called to this very, high cost of living place, that would be a huge financial burden, whereas people who are called to, say, some poor Latin American country where you can get by on, pennies by comparison, that would be a lighter burden. So 1991, the church comes along, standardizes things. Before, the varied costs were between $100 a month and $750 a month back in 1991. And so they equalized it and said $350 a month for every missionary in the church. In 2003, so 12 years later, that was increased to $400 a month. And in 2019, it was increased to $500 a month. Assuredly, because of inflation, I mean, frankly, it should be more than that if in 1991 it was $350 a month. But I guess they're trying to keep it low and probably supplement from tithing or other sources. $500 a month. So lots of purse, lots of preparing, saving, paying your way, getting a job when you're a teenager, getting your parents to help, getting the ward members to contribute. The missionaries are now no longer not bringing money. They're in fact bringing money. Maybe it's in an account that they get, deposited a little bit in their bank account every month rather than carrying 2 years worth of money around. But the point is, it's a pretty big purse, sufficient for the needs of a missionary. And then what about scrip? A bag, luggage, provisions, clothing, luggage, first aid, sewing kit, shoe polishing kit, lint rollers, a watch, umbrellas. There's all these lists you can find online, recommended lists for what missionaries need, and it is scrip to the extreme. It is basically taking the preparedness mentality in the church. If you're prepared, you shall not fear, and packing everything so that you're prepared for, whatever you might need that you can reasonably fit in a couple pieces of luggage. I myself went through this as a missionary, and there were recommended lists, and we're bringing all this. Oh, you might need that. You might need that. 3 months in the mission, I had abandoned, a third of it because I didn't need it and it was pointless to haul it around. There are entire businesses now to help with scrip. We've got Missionary Mall, established in 1997. They claim to have helped over 500,000 missionaries prepare. Now we also have Sister Missionary Mall. So all these businesses, the church's own website says, here's all the clothing to bring and all the stuff to bring. So lots of purse, lots of scrip today. So if in the early church in Jesus's day, and then in the early restored church in Joseph and Brigham and others' day, purse and scrip was something that missionaries did not bring. When did it change? Let's go back to Heber Kimball. This is 1852. So 2 decades prior to that Brigham Young quote, mind you, where he's talking, that lengthy quote I read about how missionaries would do so much better if they were going without purse or scrip, and he's really trying to push it. 1852, 18 years prior. Kimball says, "We have made a selection of a considerable number of elders to leave home and go abroad. This may be repugnant to the feelings of some. They may think it is a hazardous undertaking. But at the same time, to go now," again 1852, "is nothing compared with going out to preach the gospel 15 years ago, when they had to go not only without purse or scrip, but without any knowledge that there was a friend to take them by the hand when they arrived at their destination. Now they cannot go to any part of the world scarcely, but they will find themselves among the saints." He's saying, oh, you guys have it easy today, because now we've already, fertilized and nurtured the field, and you can go out and harvest. Because people know who the Mormons are, and me and Brigham and these other guys, we had to plow the ground, and we had to, when it was barren and no one knew what we were doing. But you guys have it easy, not only because people know who you are and they'll be more likely to receive you, but because we went without purse or scrip. And now, 1852, apparently that's not that much of a thing. So I had Brigham quotes from 1860 and 1870, right, that we read. We read George Cannon in 1880. We read Orson Pratt the same year, 1852, that Heber Kimball is saying this, all saying no purse or scrip, no purse or scrip. But here's Heber Kimball, 1852, saying, yeah, 15 years ago when we first left on these missions, 1837, 1839, when we're doing these missions, we went without purse or scrip. But today, it's already not being followed. So some missionaries are starting to not follow this even 15 years later, 1852. Fast forward a few decades. Let's go to the 1880s. It's still happening, clearly because church leaders are suggesting its importance, not necessarily requiring it appears, but still kind of saying like, hey, you ought to do this, and this is how it should be done. For example, Elder LeGrand Richards, he recounted a story from around 1896, a little bit later. He said, "I went to one of our ward meetings in the little country town where I was raised, and 2 missionaries reported their missions down in the southern states. In those days, they traveled," again, he's talking about mid-1890s, "in those days, they traveled without purse or scrip, and they had to sleep out many nights." In 1890, Brigham Young's son, one of his many children, Brigham Young Jr., he's the president of the Europe Mission, 1890, he reported, quote, "We are informed that every elder in the mission, wholly or in part, draws his support from home, as also the money to purchase the tracts, like brochures, which he distributes." So by 1890, Brigham Young Jr. is reporting that the tradition, the practice, has been mostly abandoned, that in his mission, these missionaries are all bringing what they need rather than traveling without purse or scrip. 1 year later, there's an editorial, 1891, in the Millennial Star. This is the church's long-standing publication. This article was actually a repost from the Juvenile Instructor, which was the Sunday school's publication, periodical. So now it's in 2 church periodicals, this editorial that says, "An esteemed correspondent writes upon the subject of the elders going out in these days," again 1891, "without purse or scrip. He says that in his neighborhood it is frequently discussed among the brethren. Some are of the opinion that an elder now in going abroad must have $10 or $15 a month from home to sustain him, and he desires to get some information on the subject." He quotes D&C 84, again we read that earlier, "Let no man among you from this hour take purse or scrip." The editorial continues, "There is no qualification about these words of the Lord, and though the revelation in which they are contained was given in 1832, we know of no command that has changed their force since they were given." So, church's periodical making clear that no follow-on revelation has been given, no administrative announcement from the church. To the contrary, Brigham and other church leaders are all saying, go without purse or scrip, and yet many missionaries are not, as attested to by the quote from Brigham Young Jr. and many others. So lax obedience might be what is happening here, or a cultural shift, and not necessarily a revelatory change. That's important for what we'll get into in just a minute. Let's fast forward 3 decades and go to 3.5 decades. 1928, I got this quote here from the president of the Western States Mission, who said that it would be wise if every elder in the mission could have at least 2 weeks every year traveling without purse or scrip, because it would bring them nearer to the Lord and near to the people. So here's 1928. Clearly, it's not a standard. It's not a perpetual, entire mission standard. Now it's, oh, hey, at least spend 2 weeks without purse or scrip. Just like fasting, right? Eat every other day, but have a fast day to deprive yourself. Spend the rest of your mission with your own money and your parents' money and be taken care of and secure. but go 2 weeks without, just to have this little, trial of your faith to bring you nearer to the Lord. 1937, a decade later, the president of the East Central States Mission, he would send missionaries out into the countryside during the summer without purse or scrip, and then have them work in the cities the rest of the year with occasional visits out to the country. And actually, until World War II, this summer-based approach was kind of popular in several missions, where this would be a summertime activity where they would kind of just fan out and go out. But it depended entirely upon the mission. There was no top-down enforcement or plan or program. This was at the discretion of the particular mission presidents themselves. After World War II, it's still happening from time to time. For example, in the New England mission, you've got a mission president, Elder Dilworth Young from the 70, and he's doing it, really trying to push his missionaries to do this, but he's an anomaly. One of his missionaries, Oscar McConkie Jr., thinks, hey, this is going great. We're seeing a lot of fruits from it. He writes to his dad. Well, his dad is president of the mission in California. And so he's reading his son's letter about, this favorable experience. And Oscar McConkie says, hey, this is great. Let's try this. And not just as a summertime thing. Let's do this full time, year round. Let's really lean into this. Not every leader and member of the church was on board with this. A lot of members in the area in that mission were very divided on it, feeling like maybe the burden was now on them increasingly to care for these missionaries and so forth. And so some local leaders in Los Angeles wrote to the president of the church at the time, this is George Albert Smith, and they protested the change. They said, this isn't good. We don't like this. Can you put a stop to it? President Smith, George Albert Smith, wrote back supporting the decision of the mission president, McConkie, saying, quote, he had the keys of the administration and revelation for all affairs affecting his mission. So clearly there's a deference to these local leaders. There is not a top-down program. There's not a church-wide mandate or even teaching at this point. It's really just up to the whims and the discretion and the inspiration of the particular mission presidents themselves. Now, interesting, in 1830, when the church was restored, through 1929, so 1 century, there were, as I could count in the Journal of Discourses and General Conference, 124 references to purse and scrip. 124 references over a century. Then the next century, almost century, 1930 through 2024, we go from 124 references in the prior century to only 17 in the past century. Even more interesting, of those 17 in the past almost century, only 4 of the references were not about the early church. Only 4 references in the past century weren't about, because leaders of the church will share a story of, Brigham Young when he went to England without purse or scrip, right? Like, who cares if someone in 2015 mentions that thing? I'm looking at what are the references to kind of the teaching and the importance and so forth. So only 4 references that weren't about the early church, but all 4 of those references were stories from before 1930. So they would technically kind of fit into that first century. It's these elderly general authorities who are saying, oh, when I was a young missionary, 60 years ago. And so those 4 references are sharing stories before 1930. Okay, since 2000, as one example, there's only been 2 references to purse and scrip, or frankly, missionaries traveling without purse or scrip. Only 2 references from Elder Perry, Elder Eyring. Take a listen.
Wilford Woodruff, as president of the church, described his experience in the offices of the priesthood. Quote, after I was ordained a priest, I was sent on another mission to the southern country. That was in the fall of 1834. I had a companion with me, and we started out without purse and scrip.
Sister Young and Sister Kimball came to the door and waved a farewell, which gave Brother Brigham and Brother Heber much comfort as they continued without purse or scrip towards England.
Okay, and as mentioned before, in this case, these 2 references aren't about anything modern. It's about early church missionaries. And so the modern references we have are all stories of yesteryear, but nothing about modern application of this commandment, why it changed. Well, why did it change? We've established when it changed, this kind of gradual phasing out and lax approach, despite leaders saying, do it, do it, do it. Well, why did it change? George A. Smith in 1863, he speculated, or I should say taught, that it had to do with money. Here's his quote. "Circumstances have changed. When Presidents Young, Kimball, and others left Nauvoo to go to England without purse or scrip, they left a few houseless, homeless people, a great proportion of them sick, lying out of doors with no covering, only the broad canopy of heaven on the banks of the Mississippi. What's our condition now? We can hear occasionally from our brethren in England, many of them who have been long years in the church, saying to their children, 'I will give you a little bit to eat, but when you get to Zion, you can have as much as you want, but now you must make this little do.'" He continues, "We should not send elders there to beg of them a division of their scanty pittance, or to solicit aid in paying their passage back again to America, or to give them something to carry home to their families. Not at all. God has given us possession of this goodly land. The labors of the brethren and the blessings of God have caused it to bud and blossom as the rose. Where desolation dwelt, now is the abode of plenty. We are under no necessity of sending forth the elders of Israel in the condition that we have hitherto had to do." So he claims that it has changed. And keep in mind, this is 1863. You have Brigham years later still saying, no, go do it without purse or scrip. But here's George A. Smith suggesting that it's changed and should change because now missionaries and their families coming from Utah have sufficient means to do so. And we shouldn't be asking provisions of people who can't afford them, despite the scriptures having, some interesting faith-promoting stories of people who don't have resources giving to God's, leaders and prophets and so forth, and being blessed for it. So despite the scriptures giving us those examples, here's George A. Smith saying, "No, we have enough money. They don't have money. Don't bother them. Don't ask them, of their pittance. Let's provide for ourselves." That is echoed 4 years later by John Taylor in kind of a weird way that I'll get to in just a second. Here is John Taylor's quote from 1867. He says, "We used to be in the habit of going without purse or scrip. That is the way I have traveled hundreds and thousands of miles. But then we felt as the disciples of old did. When we returned, if asked if we had lacked anything, we could say verily no. But there was a time afterwards when Jesus said, 'Let him that has a purse take it with him, and let him that has no sword sell his coat and buy one.' We do not always remain in status quo. At that time, we were the poorest people in the world, but now we are better off than the generality of mankind, and we are able to help one another. And there is no necessity for our missionaries to go under the circumstances they have done heretofore. And since it is the counsel that they shall not, why let us do what we can to help them?" Okay, that scripture he read from is Luke 22. "Let him that has a purse take it with him." Let's put a pin in that, and I'll come back to that a little bit later to try and see if we can unravel it. 1869, 2 years after this John Taylor quote, the president of the European Mission noted a growing tendency for elders to bring their own money from home. One missionary was paying all his own expenses and, quote, in the mission president's words, "Many are now paying their own way to a considerable extent." Yet there's no immediate sign of disapproval of this growing departure from Mormon tradition and, frankly, scriptural commandment. And so we have to pause and say, okay, there's one reason given by George A. Smith, John Taylor, saying that, hey, we're wealthy enough, we're no longer poor, we don't need to do this anymore, we shouldn't ask from poor people what our missionaries need. But God's commandment did not say anything about it applying only when you can't take care of yourself. There was no qualifier, no condition saying when you can provide for yourself, go ahead and do so. It would seem, especially from teachings of early church leaders to support this, that going without purse or scrip is about relying on the Lord, learning to trust him, developing your own testimony, proving to the world, right, that you are sincere in what you're doing. Not like, hey, I need to bum a free ride because I'm currently poor, but once I have money, I no longer need to bum a free ride. It's about something more substantive, it would appear. So that's one stated reason why things have changed. Another one is perhaps the shift in population from country locations to urban locations. So here's a quote from a Dialogue Journal article about purse and scrip. The author says that when missionaries were in cities, it was more difficult to find people who would provide free room and board. As a result, missionaries started receiving support from their families, relatives, and friends. They used the money to rent apartments in cities. Periodically, they would still travel into rural areas for country tracting, often without purse or scrip. And so country tracting, this is the kind of summertime or 2-week, like, hey, let's go out to the rural areas, but then we're going to return to our home base in the city where we're renting an apartment rather than asking for room and board from someone. One missionary who did this country tracting in the East Central States mission, of his converts during his mission, he said the following: "They had no place to go to church. They had no other members with which to associate. There was no place to participate in church programs. Consequently, after a while, they would drift away and leave the church and go with the neighboring community church." He continued that while traveling without purse or scrip built missionaries' testimonies, he said, "Leaving people alone in the mission field like that is probably not a wise idea." This is in the words of just one missionary who had something to say on the matter, given his own experience. But it does raise this interesting point that maybe cultural population demographic shifts over time necessitated or spurred some changes where now the missionaries are focused on more densely populated areas where they can interact with more people rather than spending a lot of their time traversing the distance between, the two farms and so forth. So you can see maybe some utilitarian prudence here in shifting. Really, the question is, if God gave us this commandment, can we just shift for utilitarian reasons, or should we, forbear and still do what he's commanded pending other revelations, which, we've yet to see. Another potential reason for the change is legal issues. As nation states started imposing a lot more restrictions around visas and entering their country, it might be difficult to send missionaries to other countries without showing that missionaries will be provided for financially so that they won't be a drain on that country's welfare system and the people. Well, the solution here is you could just call people from their own countries, especially with the size of the church now or even decades ago. So you don't need to send missionaries to other countries. So if that is indeed a restriction, and if indeed God has commanded us to go without purse or scrip, then maybe we just don't send people to foreign countries and they just stay within their countries so that we can get around those visa mandates. Another legal issue is vagabonds, which is like a wandering bum that many states had and presumably have laws against vagrancy. Here's a little snippet from 1998 from Thomas Monson.
In 1926, President Fred Tadge, president of the German-Austrian Mission, called a mission conference to be held at Dresden, Germany, in August. The missionaries were to walk to this conference from their fields of labor, basically without purse or scrip, although they had to carry a small amount of money or they could be arrested as vagabonds.
And so that seemed to be the approach to get around these laws for missionaries who still were traveling or trying to travel without purse or scrip, was carrying the minimal amount. I mentioned earlier Elder Dilworth Young, Quorum of the 70, president of the New England Mission, who was very much kind of in favor of missionaries going without purse or scrip and really trying to push his missionaries to do it after World War II. In his mission, each missionary, like with what President Monson said, would carry just enough money to meet the requirements of the vagrancy laws. So like in Massachusetts, it was $2. In Maine, it was $5. And then President Young also instructed his missionaries to contact the local police department and tell them what they were doing. And they were supposed to tell the police department that they were dependent for their physical needs upon the hospitality of those who want to hear our message, rather than saying, hey, we're traveling without purse or scrip. And so basically kind of proactively saying, hey, we're not vagrants. This is kind of part of our faith. Just want you to know what we're out here doing. Another reason why we may have changed away from traveling without purse or scrip is that there are fewer people passing it on and inculcating it in the rising generation. So, Dilworth Young, to use him as an example, because he was such a passionate advocate of this. In fact, twice in General Conference, he favorably mentioned traveling without purse or scrip, relating his own experiences as a missionary. So he's two of the references in General Conference post-1930. And so he asked missionaries to go without purse or scrip because he himself had that experience. He knew what it was like. He had personal witness and testimony. He could kind of authentically say, no, this is important. And so each generation passing, if more and more people are being lax about this and not doing it, even back in the mid-1800s already starting that trend, then you get to the early 1900s and the mid-1900s, you have far fewer church leaders who themselves have gone through this and who can attest to the importance of it. Everyone else traveled with purse and scrip. And so they're rationalizing in their mind, why that commandment no longer applies, or they're just ignoring it and kind of setting it aside, pushing it down the Mormon memory hole. So this is kind of a compounding problem. The more time that goes on, the fewer people there are that do this. The fewer people there are that do this, that work their way into positions of leadership in missions or general authorities, the fewer teachings there are inculcating it in the rising generation. Oscar McConkie Jr., the missionary I mentioned earlier, who was in President Young, Dilworth Young's mission, who wrote to his dad in California, he said that the man who replaced Dilworth Young no doubt was just as good a man as President Young, but he hadn't had that experience of traveling without purse or scrip and didn't have that sort of drive to do it. So one of his own missionaries is here attesting to the fact that it was President Young, Dilworth Young's personal experience that was driving him to kind of pass it on. So this general degradation might be another reason why we no longer do it. The taking on the traditions of the fathers of traveling with purse and scrip and being prepared. And then finally, this is kind of relating to some of the other reasons, but could just be cultural change. Now having a more cash-based economy rather than kind of an agrarian, farm-based economy. And so the expectation that you should have a medium of exchange with which to buy what you need rather than being dependent upon, farmers who have extra eggs or, chickens or a bed to sleep in. And then the decline of hospitality. We don't really have wandering preachers traveling, across America anymore. And so the cultural change has shifted, and therefore we as missionaries who are part of that culture have kind of shifted along with it. And without the teaching and the reinforcement to push back against the culture, we've embraced it. Now, I mentioned earlier the John Taylor quote was kind of interesting, where he was saying, well, we have money now and we don't need to do it anymore. He says, again, 1867, we're better off than the generality of mankind. We're able to help one another. There is no necessity for our missionaries to undergo the circumstances they have done heretofore. 1867. And yet, John Taylor, in 1883, so a decade and a half later, he said that preaching without purse or scrip throughout the earth is, quote, a duty placed upon us by the Almighty. What? Right? And even that 1867 quote from John Taylor, 3 years later, that Brigham, with that 1870 quote I mentioned, saying that missionaries would be much more successful if they went without purse or scrip. But John Taylor himself contradicting what he said a decade and a half prior. Oh, no, we don't need to do it like we used to do it. And then he's saying it's a duty placed upon us by the Almighty. So clearly there's confusion, which relates to a lot of the musings that I do, where we get conflicting messages, different leaders saying different things, and a lack of clarity, doctrinal, revelatory clarity about what's going on as the culture degrades and as we move our position away from what it, concretely says in the Revelation. Okay, let's return momentarily to Doctrine and Covenants, section 84, for another reference that adds another interesting twist to why missionaries should travel without purse or scrip and how they should handle their affairs. So again, from section 84, going to verses 103 and 104, it says, again, verily, verily, I say unto you, it is expedient that every man who goes forth to proclaim mine everlasting gospel, that inasmuch as they have families, and receive money by gift, that they should send it unto them, or make use of it for their benefit, as the Lord shall direct them, for thus it seemeth me good. And let all those who have not families, who receive money, send it up unto the bishop in Zion, or unto the bishop in Ohio, that it may be consecrated for the bringing forth of the revelations and the printing thereof, and for establishing Zion. Okay, so early days, missionaries were called who had left home, wife, children. And so that first verse was saying, if they have family homes, send the money back for their support, because the main provider, the husband, is not there working, and the family is relying upon the consecrated efforts of the saints to support them in the absence of their father and husband. So if you have a family that's dependent upon you, send the gifts, send the money home. If you don't, if you're a bachelor, if you don't have a family depending upon you, then send the money to be consecrated. Why? Because you're supposed to stay traveling without purse or scrip, right? Continually. When I was first unpacking this, I'm like, okay, well, was the idea that when you start your mission, you're supposed to go without purse or scrip, right? Leave behind everything that you have And then as people start giving you money, if some wealthy person comes along and says, hey, here's, $100,000 to pay for the rest of your mission, just put it in an account and draw down on it, slowly. Hey, I don't have to travel without purse or scrip anymore because, God has greatly blessed me and this person has donated. And, or if, some member is like, yeah, you can stay at my home the entire time. You don't have to travel from place to place, just you can lodge here. But it seems to me from my studies that that's not the purpose and the intent and the spiritual benefit and the commandment of traveling without purse or scrip, that it's meant to be a continual thing, not an initial thing. And so if you get money, here in section 84, it's saying you got to send it either to your family or to the church to consecrate it for the building up of Zion, but you're supposed to be a pass-through, a conduit for those resources so that you can stay in that position of traveling without purse or scrip. Now, earlier in the John Taylor quote, he referenced Luke 22, where Christ himself changed or appears to have changed the circumstances or the context of the commandment. So this in Luke 22 is after the Last Supper. It's just before the Garden of Gethsemane. And again, as referenced previously, here's Luke 22, verses 35 and 36. When I sent you without purse and scrip and shoes, lacked ye anything? And they said, nothing. Then Jesus said unto them, but now he that hath a purse, let him take it, and likewise his scrip. And he that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. So why the change? Why did Jesus first say, travel without purse or scrip? And then a few chapters later here, he's getting close to, suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane and the crucifixion. Why is he saying now travel with purse and scrip? Maybe it's because of different contexts. In Luke 10, it's purely proselyting. It's no one really knows who you are. You're not a threat. There's some, sideways glances from the Pharisees and so forth, but largely you're just whatever, right? Versus in chapter 22, the flames have been fanned. Things are more hostile. Maybe Jesus is saying, hey, you're going out into enemy territory. They know who you are. They want to kill you. So get a sword and have provisions because there's not going to be as many people there to take care of you. I don't know. I'm merely speculating here. And I'm speculating because I can find nothing about this. I searched general conference talks. I searched Journal of Discourses. I searched bloggers and podcasters. I searched general Christian commentary and found nothing. Number one, nothing from our church leaders talking about the before and after, why Jesus said this in Luke 22 versus the difference in Luke 10, nor what that change means for us today. Nothing. No commentary, no teachings, but couldn't even really find anything at all, let alone anything satisfactory from general Christendom. So that's kind of interesting, which is why I have to speculate here about why Jesus may have said the one thing and then the other. But from my vantage point, the concern is negated because of modern revelation reinstituting the commandment to travel without purse or scrip. So section 24, section 84, which I read earlier, Jesus saying, hey, I commanded my early disciples to do it. You're going to do it too. Let every man from this hour go without purse or scrip, or rather it says the inverse. Let no man from this hour who's going to be a missionary travel with purse or scrip. So modern revelation seems to kind of override that Luke 22 thing. And so absent some modern revelation overturning section 84, that remains the commandment. The church's Millennial Star editorializing in 1891 again that, hey, we know of no commandment that has overridden this, despite already most missionaries no longer doing it because they're just changing with the demographics and the culture and the comfort of families just wanting to make sure their children are provided for and so forth. Another little interesting thing here is that, maybe this only applied to elders. The first sister missionaries were called in 1898. I could not find any record of sister missionaries following this model. So perhaps, in the missions that were still pushing for traveling without purse and scrip, maybe the proselyting sisters weren't expected to do so because of just that gender dynamic. Don't know. That was kind of an interesting thing where I was like, hey, I wonder if sister missionaries ever travel without purse or scrip. Could find nothing. So I presume that was the case, that it wasn't expected of them, that it was about the elders. Okay, let's wrap up with a few thoughts questions and concerns. So, missionaries today have greater certainty about where their next meal is coming from, but consequently, they have less of an opportunity to exercise faith that their needs will be met. When they've got the ward mission leader doing his job and everything, right, lining up all the dinners with all the members and all the places, you don't really have to rely on the Lord as much if you're being taken care of. The general missionary fund, for example, into which everyone is contributing and which disperses the money out to missionaries in that equalized formula, it's certainly efficient, right? With members contributing, missionaries, their parents all contributing. But the commandment makes clear that the ones to be paying and supporting missionaries are the beneficiaries of their teaching, not the already converted. So as I read the scriptures where Jesus is talking about traveling without purse or scrip and proving the world, it's about saying, hey, we're going to see if they are willing to feed you, if they are going to support you. If we go back to section 84, let me see if I can find this really quick. So, and section 84 is where we get the commandment, and Jesus says, whoso receiveth you receiveth me, and the same will feed you and clothe you and give you money. So that's kind of interesting that it seems to be more of a investigator-based system of provision rather than a member one. In other words, we shouldn't rely on the members to feed and lodge the missionaries. The true test of faith isn't to get the already converted to throw you a bone and help you out. It's to rely upon the very people that you're out trying to convert. Another thought is that restoring the traveling without person script could be a good filter for missionary applicants. Like, it's one thing to say, oh, look how many missionaries we have, and we're always celebrating that there's more missionaries, but not every missionary is a good missionary, and not every missionary should be a missionary. There are plenty of people who are out on missions that have no business going to begin with for a variety of reasons. And so I don't know that we want maximum numbers of missionaries as the kind of goal and imperative. I think we want the right missionaries. We want faithful missionaries. We want humble and powerful missionaries. And so how do we get them? Well, maybe this could be a filter. The missionaries who are really willing to exercise the faith to travel without purse or scrip, as did the early missionaries, both in the restored dispensation and in Jesus' time, might filter out some of the missionaries who shouldn't be there, the ones causing problems, the ones, giving birth in the mission field. Anyways, I've got stories. So that's kind of a thought in my mind. I wonder if that would be kind of a filter. And as we've said before, you have to develop more faith when you have to rely on the Lord. But maybe traveling without purse or scrip, you're too focused on the basis of where your next meal will come from as opposed to preaching the gospel. I'm not going to read it, but I came across the story of Wilford Woodruff in 1834, and he's traveling with his companion, and they're so obsessed with their lodging and their food and what they're going to do, and they're spending so much time walking from place to place, asking people for a meal and so forth. And they hear someone singing, and they're like, oh, someone who sings must have food. And so they pick up their stuff and run after this guy, and they were able to get a meal. But so much of their time consumed with trying to, find their next meal, trying to find their lodging. Here's Truman Madsen. He said in the early stages, he as a missionary doing this, we were so preoccupied with our stomachs and with the question of lodging that we in fact failed. But when we decided that we would put bearing witness and arranging meetings first and not worry about our stomachs, the work began to succeed. So even he's saying, like, for the less faithful missionaries, it becomes this like time suck, this obsessive focus. But the aspiration, the spiritual benefit, the purpose of it is to get missionaries to kind of exercise that faith, to rely upon the Lord and focus on what they're supposed to be doing. I think there's also an argument to be made that this is about not trusting the arm of flesh. And so when you're called as an ambassador of Jesus, when you're a missionary, that you're supposed to, Jesus himself saying, does not God care for the sparrows, right? Like, God will take care of you, but you have to step into that position of faith. And, maybe another thought in conclusion is that maybe it's not the greatest public relations position to send starving teenagers all across the world when the church is building, shopping malls and managing tens of billions of dollars in market investments and all kinds of corporations. Like, that dynamic might be a little weird. And so maybe from a PR perspective, it's like, let's have a program to take care of our own rather than have this image of this wealthy multi-billion-dollar church requiring their teenagers to starve. Now, as early church leaders said, it is an opportunity, or would be, to say we are practicing the same thing that Jesus told his apostles and the early missionaries to do, and that would build some credence. Let's wrap up with a quote from George Cannon going back to 1884. He says that sending young men upon missions is an excellent method of testing their integrity and also of giving them an opportunity of proving of themselves whether the testimony they've heard from their parents and others is true. When a young man leaves home to go to a foreign land, in the midst of a cold-hearted and prejudiced world, without purse or scrip, with no funds in his pocket to depend upon to pay his way, and has to depend upon his Maker and upon the promises which he has made, he is in a most excellent position to learn for himself the truth of the words of the Savior and the truth of the testimonies that he has heard from his parents and friends. I rejoice exceedingly that our young men have this opportunity, because it brings home to them in a most unmistakable and convincing manner the truth of those testimonies they have heard. When a man has no food to eat, when he has no friends, and is a stranger in a strange land, traveling as a servant of God, he has a good opportunity of testing for himself whether there is a God, and whether that God hears and answers his prayers. In this way, faith becomes knowledge, because if a man prays to God and asks for that which he wants, and God gives it to him, then he knows for himself that God hears and answers prayer. It is in this way that the knowledge of the gospel that we have received is perpetuated in our hearts and in the hearts of our children, transmitted from one generation to another, as it has been and is being done at the present time among these Latter-day Saints. Concluding, he says, today there's a host of young men growing up in this country who have in this manner proved for themselves the truth of that which I am now speaking of. It was in this manner that I learned most convincingly in my youth that this was the work of God. I believed it, yes, I may say I knew it to be true, but when I was sent out as a missionary without purse and scrip, and compelled to feel after God and ask him for those things that I wanted, I learned to my entire satisfaction that when I did need God's blessings, he was at hand to confer them upon me, according to the desires of my heart and the necessities of my case. My concluding point is that we have many, many missionaries returning home and quickly going inactive. Many. And that might be a testament to the fact that certain of these missionaries should never have gone. But it may also be an opportunity that if they are put through experiences much like George Cannon here said, if they are provided the opportunity to deepen their faith into knowledge, that might create a more sure witness. It might create a stronger testimony. It might help them endure the cultural baggage they have to wade through, the spiritual muck that is bombarded upon them through social media and our society today. We wouldn't lose as many of them in our church community. They wouldn't abandon their faith so quickly, because it's not just going through the motions of a mission and checking the boxes and having the experience, but being cared for the entire time and not having to have that deep reliance on the Lord. There might be some wisdom here in God's commandment to travel without purse or scrip, not only for the benefit of proving the world, but of strengthening these very missionaries and creating this intergenerational strong network of missionaries, soon to be church leaders and members of the church who can testify and have that knowledge of their reliance upon the God, and they can have that surety for themselves to know, I lived this, I experienced it, I know it works. So what do you think? I would love to know, are you aware of any revelation that changed this? Do we just say, oh, well, we have this implicit assumption that if things changed in the church, that therefore the Lord must have revealed it to the leaders of the church. And yet in this case, so many examples of church leaders saying, we got to do this, we got to do this. And the precipitous decline of participation by missionaries actually doing it. So I don't know that that's a satisfactory answer that, oh, well, it must have been revelation that changed it. We know of nothing. No one said anything. The past century has been effectively silent on this matter completely. This seems to me more of a cultural shift and a generational degradation of following God's commandment. What would that look like? What would it have looked like for my mission? I don't know. I served in Honduras, extremely poor people. They often fed us. I mean, they had nothing. They had barely anything, and yet they would still feed us. Lodging would have been interesting, right? But that's the point, is that the reliance on God produces a very different type of missionary and experience with the people that you're teaching. So let me know in the comments, what do you think? Should this be reinstituted? Are we neglecting to follow this commandment? Has the commandment changed for utilitarian or cultural or other reasons? But, God said, from this hour, let no man take purse or scrip. And until we hear otherwise, I would assume that we're supposed to still be doing that. Let me know in the comments what you think. Until next Sunday, I'll see you later.